The digital clock on the conference room wall ticked to 6:47 a.m. That was the bizarre, highly specific time Julian Thorne had requested for our mandatory alignment sync. I had been an architect at Aeroflux Logistics for over 10 years, and I had never been called into a meeting before the sun had fully risen. At 55 years old, my morning routine usually involved a strong mug of black coffee and a quiet review of the overnight server logs. Not sitting in a silent glass box across from the CTO, Julian sat perfectly still across the mahogany table. He was 35, wearing a minimalist black turtleneck, and looked entirely too awake for this hour. Beside him sat Brenda, the head of HR. She had a thick, unmarked manila folder resting squarely in front of her. Her expression was completely neutral, her hands folded neatly over the edge of the cardboard. That was the exact moment I knew my tenure at Aeroflux Logistics was coming to an end. I placed my coffee cup down, waiting for Julian or Brenda to speak first. Julian leaned forward, steepling his fingers. He cleared his throat and looked directly into my eyes. "Gideon," Julian began, his voice perfectly modulated. "We appreciate everything you have built for us. But Aeroflux Logistics is pivoting toward a more agile, machine-driven future. As of this morning, your position as architect is being eliminated." I stared at him, letting the words hang in the freezing air of the conference room. I had built the core logic that kept their delivery drones in the sky. "Eliminated?" I asked, keeping my voice flat. "Who is going to manage the flux engine? You have 0 engineers on staff who understand the deep architecture." Julian offered a thin, patronizing smile. He picked up his metallic pen and twirled it slowly between his fingers. "We do not need anyone to manage it, Gideon. The board ran a comprehensive parallel simulation last month. We implemented an automated oversight protocol that handles all routine maintenance. To be perfectly blunt, software replaced you. The system runs itself now without human interference. We are trimming the fat across the engineering department to maximize profit margins." Software replaced you. The words echoed in my head. He honestly believed the complex ecosystem I engineered from scratch could be maintained by a generic management algorithm. Brenda slid the manila folder across the table. It stopped inches from my hands. "This is your severance package." "Gideon," Brenda said. Her tone was rehearsed, practically legally sterile. "Aeroflux Logistics is offering you 6 months of base pay and health benefits. All we need is your signature on the exit agreement." I opened the folder. The contract was 30 pages long. I flipped past the standard non-compete clauses. I knew what to look for. When a tech company fires the creator of their core infrastructure, they always bury the real theft in the final pages. I found it on page 28, section 4. It was an intellectual property assignment clause. The legal jargon was dense, but the ultimate meaning was obvious. By signing the severance, I would retroactively surrender all personal licensing rights to the proprietary subroutines I brought with me when I joined Aeroflux Logistics. They were trying to steal the foundational code that I owned outright, the exact code their drone fleet relied on every day to avoid mid-air collisions. Julian checked his watch. "It is a very generous offer, Gideon. We suggest you sign it now so we can process the payment." I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. "I will not be signing this," I said, looking right at Julian. "Not today, not ever." Julian frowned, his calm slipping for a fraction of a second. "Gideon, do not be difficult. If you refuse to sign, you leave here with nothing, no severance, no benefits. You are 55 years old. Take the deal." "The deal is an attempt to steal my intellectual property," I replied, standing up. "You think software replaced me. You are about to find out exactly who owns that software." Before they could speak, I turned and walked out of the conference room. I ignored Julian calling my name. My mind raced ahead, calculating my exact next steps. I walked briskly down the empty hallway toward my desk in the engineering wing. When I originally integrated my proprietary pathfinding software into the servers, I included a specific stipulation in my contract. It was Clause 9C. The legal team had barely glanced at it, assuming it was standard boilerplate. Clause 9C stated clearly that the operational license for my core algorithms was tied directly to my active employment. If I was ever involuntarily terminated, the license auto-renewal was immediately voided. I sat down at my workstation. The monitors woke from sleep, illuminating my face with lines of raw server diagnostics. I opened the root command terminal. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with practiced precision. I bypassed the standard security layers and accessed the deep registry of the Flux engine. Julian thought the software could run without me. He thought he could delete the architect and keep the house. I pulled up the licensing module. The current status showed as active. I initiated the termination sequence tied to Clause 9C. A prompt appeared on the screen, asking for final confirmation to revoke the enterprise license. I hit the Enter key. The terminal blinked, accepting the command. I did not shut the system down immediately. That would be too easy to fix, too easy to blame on a disgruntled employee. Instead, I set a dead man's switch. I triggered a silent countdown program that would sever the connection between the drones and the core routing logic. I set the expiration timer for exactly midnight. At 11:59 p.m., Aeroflux Logistics would be a global powerhouse. At midnight, every single automated delivery vehicle in their fleet would lose its pathfinding ability. They would be blind, grounded, and entirely useless. I locked my computer, grabbed my coat, and walked out of the building. The sun was finally rising, and I had exactly 17 hours to watch Julian Thorne's empire collapse. I remember the smell of stale coffee and desperation from 10 years ago. Aeroflux Logistics was on the verge of bankruptcy. We had exactly 3 weeks of runway left. The legacy routing system was dropping 15% of our freight manifests. Executives were panicking, throwing blame around conference rooms while the stock price plummeted. I was 45 then, and I moved a cot into the server room. For 14 straight days, I did not go home. I built Nexus Core from scratch, weaving together a monolith that could handle 10,000 transactions a second without a single failure. It saved the company. The board gave themselves bonuses, and I got a plaque, but I also remembered the bloodbath before Nexus Core. During the previous layoff round, I watched good engineers get escorted out by security, their badges deactivated while their code still kept the lights on. That was when I realized loyalty was a one-way street. So, while I was constructing the foundation of Nexus Core, I added Clause 9C. It was not a logic bomb or malicious code. It was a simple dependency check tied to my employee ID and active biometric token. If my credentials were removed from the Active Directory, Nexus Core would initiate a grace period of exactly 72 hours. After that, it would gracefully degrade, locking down the primary databases to protect the integrity of the freight manifests. No one knew it was there. I buried it under 50,000 lines of kernel-level subroutines. Now, at 55, I was sitting in a glass-walled meeting room, watching Julian Thorne, our 35-year-old CTO, look at his phone while I was supposed to be doing a knowledge transfer. Julian had been here for 8 months. He spent most of his time talking about synergies and leveraging the cloud. Next to him sat Holden, a 24-year-old junior developer whose primary skill seemed to be copy-pasting code snippets. There were 3 other junior developers in the room, all looking completely bored. "So, Gideon," Holden said, sipping an iced latte. "I was looking at the repository. Why is this all one giant monolith? We really should be breaking this down into AWS microservices. It is 2026, man." I looked at Holden. His laptop was covered in stickers from hackathons. "Nexus Core processes 4,000 routing decisions a day," I explained, keeping my voice even. "It relies on tightly coupled memory management to achieve microsecond latency. If you split it into microservices, the network overhead alone will cause cascading timeouts across the entire supply chain." Holden rolled his eyes. "Yeah, but AWS handles all that now. We can just spin up a Kubernetes cluster, put a load balancer in front of it, and we are golden." The other junior developers nodded in agreement. They did not understand memory allocation. They did not understand thread pooling. They just wanted to write wrappers and let a cloud provider handle the actual computing. Julian finally looked up from his phone. "Listen, Gideon, we appreciate what you did for Aeroflux back in the day, but we are moving toward a more agile, decentralized architecture. Holden here is going to lead the refactoring effort. We just need you to show them how to compile the legacy build so they can start carving it up." I felt a strange sense of calm. I had spent 10 years treating Nexus Core like my child, protecting it from bad management. I patched it on Thanksgiving. I rebooted backup servers on New Year's Eve. And now, Julian was handing it over to a 24-year-old who thought latency was a buzzword. All right, I said. The compilation instructions are in the master repository. You need to run the specific build script. It requires a 64-bit environment with at least 128 gigabytes of RAM for the initial memory mapping. Holden scoffed. 128 gigabytes? For a build process? That is ridiculous. We will just containerize it and run it on a spot instance. Do what you want, I said. I stood up and closed my laptop. The documentation is fully updated. If you follow the deployment guide exactly, you will not have any problems. Julian smiled a slick corporate smile. Great. Thanks for being a team player, Gideon. HR has your exit package ready. We will mail your personal items to you. I have them right here, I said, gesturing to the small cardboard box sitting by my feet. I had packed it before the meeting. A coffee mug, a picture of my dog, and the useless plaque they gave me 10 years ago. I picked up the box and walked toward the door. I paused and looked back. Holden was already sharing his screen, showing the others a diagram of how he planned to tear apart my life's work. They were completely oblivious to the complexity of the machine they were about to dismantle. They had no idea about the fail-safes, the data validation loops, or Clause 9C. Good luck, I said softly. None of them looked up. I walked out of the glass room, down the long corridor, and past the rows of empty cubicles. I handed my badge to the security guard at the front desk. The moment he scanned it, the system registered my departure. The clock on Clause 9C started ticking, 72 hours. I stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. The air felt lighter than it had in a decade. I walked to my car, put the box in the passenger seat, and started the engine. I did not look back. My phone was turned off. Let them build their microservices. Let Julian Thorne explain to the board why the freight manifests locked down. Let Holden try to containerize a system currently counting down to its own graceful degradation. They said software replaced me, the software. I sat in my apartment watching the clock tick toward midnight. The silence in my living room was absolute, a stark contrast to the chaos I knew was about to unfold at Aeroflux Logistics. I was 55 years old, an architect who had given a decade to building the systems that kept that company running. Julian Thorne, the 35-year-old CTO, decided my experience was a liability, that I was too expensive. He replaced me with software. But I made the software. Midnight arrived. It did not come with alarms. It came with a silent shift in the digital architecture. Deep within the servers of Aeroflux Logistics, a date check executed. The system license expired. Nexus Core, the heart of their routing operation, bled out silently. There was no catastrophic crash. The system simply stopped accepting new data, stopped routing trucks. It became a read-only monument to its past efficiency. I made a cup of black coffee and sat by the window. I knew the timeline intimately. Warehouse queues would start backing up first. Then automated loading bays would freeze, waiting for routing instructions that would never come. Drivers would sit in their cabs, staring at blank dispatch screens. It would take a few hours for the volume of stalled logistics to reach critical mass, for the backlogs to cascade to the executive dashboards. The silence on my end was the sound of millions grinding to a halt on their end. At 3:23 a.m., panic broke through the surface. I did not receive the alerts, of course. My access had been revoked weeks ago. But I could picture it perfectly. Julian Thorne, likely asleep in his loft, jolted awake by the ringing of his emergency pager. The system he touted as self-sustaining, the marvel that justified my termination, was failing on a fundamental level. He promised the board a frictionless future now. He was waking up to a nightmare. I imagined Julian rushing to his laptop, eyes blurry with panic. He would log into the master dashboard and see a sea of red alerts. 32 servers down. Not physically down, their power supplies would still be humming, but functionally dead. The logistics grid was paralyzed. The supply chain was bleeding money by the second. By 4 a.m., the CEO would be on the line, furious, demanding answers that Julian did not have. Julian was a visionary, a man of concepts, not a mechanic. He did not know how the engine worked. He would scramble, calling junior engineers, demanding they fix a system they barely understood. The server logs would show the truth, if they knew where to look. Eventually, one of his panicked engineers would dig deep enough into the Nexus Core authorization modules. They would bypass the surface errors and find the final entry in the audit trail. A simple HTTP response code. 4001 unauthorized. It was not a bug. It was a feature. A feature I explicitly documented in the blueprints that Julian had casually skimmed and ignored. When I built Nexus Core, I structured the core algorithmic components under a separate licensing agreement. I did not do this maliciously. I did it because those algorithms were proprietary solutions I developed before my tenure at Aeroflux. I licensed them to the company on an annual basis, a standard practice that Julian had overlooked in his rush to modernize. When Julian fired me, he did not just fire Gideon Vance, the senior architect. He terminated the relationship with Ironclad Solutions LLC, the entity that held the copyright to those algorithms. I owned Ironclad Solutions LLC. I owned the license, and the license had just expired. I sat sipping the bitter coffee, visualizing Julian's face as the realization hit him. He would see the entity name attached to the expired license. He would look it up in the state registry. He would see my name listed as the sole proprietor. The man he dismissed as a relic was now the owner of the software holding his network hostage. He would try to patch it, of course. He would assemble a war room and demand a quick fix. But Nexus Core was a complex web of interdependent microservices. The routing algorithms were encrypted and designed to fail securely if tampered with. Any attempt to bypass the license check would trigger a lockdown protocol, completely bricking the entire system. And then there was the legal reality, a trap Julian had walked right into. Julian was facing a massive corporate liability. By continuing to attempt to use, modify, or circumvent the software without a valid active license, Aeroflux Logistics was in direct violation of federal law. Specifically, 17 U.S.C. Section 106 applied. Copyright infringement. They were unauthorized users of proprietary intellectual property. Every minute the servers remained on, they were compounding their legal jeopardy and financial damages. The sun began to rise. I felt a strange sense of calm. I was simply a businessman waiting for a negotiation. Julian Thorne failed to understand that the foundation of his modern era was built on my code, my logic, my intellectual property. At 7 a.m., my personal phone rang. It was an unknown number. I let it ring. The phone stopped, then immediately started ringing again. I took a slow breath, picked it up, and answered. It was the CEO's assistant, voice trembling, asking if I was available for an immediate emergency conference call with Julian Thorne and the legal team. I told her I had a very tight schedule, but I could perhaps spare a few minutes to discuss a new licensing agreement for Ironclad Solutions LLC. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter at 6:37 a.m. The caller ID flashed with the name of the Aeroflux Logistics corporate office. I let it ring 2 times before picking up. I was 55 years old, an architect who had spent the last 10 years building their entire infrastructure from the ground up, only to be pushed out by a 35-year-old CTO who thought he knew better. Julian Thorne had assumed my software, the very system that kept Aeroflux running, was company property. He was wrong. Now they were finding that out the hard way. Gideon Vance speaking, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. Gideon, thank God you picked up, a voice panted on the other end. It was Marcus, the chief operating officer. We're in a bit of a situation. The logistics grid has locked us out. All routing nodes are failing validation checks, and the core database is refusing new inputs. Julian says it is a licensing error. That is correct, I replied, staring out the window. The trial period for the routing module expired at midnight. Without a valid license key, the software automatically suspends operation to prevent unauthorized usage, authorized usage. Gideon, this is Aeroflux. We own that system. No, Marcus, you do not, I said. Check your employment contracts and the intellectual property waivers. You will find that I retain the rights to the core algorithms. I licensed it to Aeroflux Logistics for a nominal fee while I was employed there. When Julian terminated my contract last week, he also terminated the licensing agreement. There was a long silence on the line. I could hear muffled shouting in the background. It sounded like a board meeting devolving into a panic attack. Get on a Zoom call with us. Right now, Marcus demanded. We need to fix this before the morning shift starts routing the European shipments. I sent them a link to a meeting room I had set up the night before. I joined the call. The gallery view populated with the faces of the Aeroflux executive board. They looked haggard, sitting around the polished mahogany table. At the end of the table sat Julian Thorne, his normally perfect hair disheveled, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Gideon," the CEO began, "we seem to have a misunderstanding regarding the software you developed during your tenure." "There is no misunderstanding," I said. "Julian made it perfectly clear that my services were no longer required. He stated that the software had replaced me. What he failed to realize was that I made the software, and I own it." "We paid you a salary to write it," Julian snapped, slamming a hand on the table. "It is work for hire." "You paid me a salary to architect your logistics network," I corrected him. "The underlying routing engine was developed on my own time, on my own hardware, before I even signed on with Aeroflux Logistics. I integrated it into your system under a revocable license. If you look at the source code, you will see the copyright notices clearly stated in the headers. By continuing to use it after my termination, you have violated my copyright under 17 U.S.C. Section 106. The statutory damages for willful infringement are quite substantial." The color drained from the CEO's face. He turned to look at the legal counsel. She gave a small, barely perceptible nod. "What do you want, Gideon?" the CEO asked, his voice flat. "I want what is fair," I said. "First, the licensing fee for the software will be double the original rate we discussed, and it will be paid annually, in advance." I paused, letting the numbers sink in. "Second," I continued, "I retain full design control over the architecture. Julian does not touch the codebase. His engineering team does not touch the codebase without my explicit approval. I will not have my work compromised by amateur hour. And third," I said, taking a sip of my coffee, "you will retain me as an independent consultant for a minimum of 2 years. My rate will be 3x my previous salary. I will dictate my own hours and I will work remotely. If you agree to these terms, I can have the system back online in 5 minutes. If you do not, I suggest you start looking for a new routing solution. I hear it takes about 3 years to build one from scratch." The silence in the boardroom was deafening. They had built their entire global operation around a system they did not own, and they had just fired the only person who knew how it worked. They were bleeding out, and I held the only tourniquet. "Julian," the CEO said quietly, not looking at him, "is there any way we can bypass the lock?" Julian swallowed hard. "No, the encryption is tied to the central node. If we try to brute force it, the database will wipe the routing tables as a security measure." The CEO closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, the defeat was absolute. "Send over the contracts, Gideon," he said. "We will sign them. I already sent them to your legal department 10 minutes ago," I said. "I will wait here while you review them. But please hurry. The European market opens soon, and I would hate for you to miss the morning rush." I watched them scramble. A bunch of highly paid executives reduced to frantic panic by a 55-year-old architect sitting in his kitchen. I took another sip of my coffee. It tasted exceptionally good this morning. The digital clock on the conference room wall displayed 11:57 p.m. The air felt heavy, completely stagnant as the board of directors stared at me. Julian Thorne sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, his face a pale mask of barely suppressed rage. He looked every bit of his 35 years right now, though the arrogant spark in his eyes had finally burned out. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the building ventilation. I looked down at the physical contract resting on the table in front of me. It outlined my terms precisely, including the astronomical consulting fee and complete legal immunity. I picked up the heavy brass pen provided by their lead counsel. I did not rush. I let them sweat out another minute. At 11:58 p.m., I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name, Gideon Vance. The signature was clean and deliberate. I slid the folder across the table to the CEO, who snatched it like a drowning man grabbing a life preserver. I opened my laptop. The terminal window was already waiting. I typed the 16-character override sequence that would reinitialize the primary database connections for Nexus Core. My fingers moved over the keys with the muscle memory built from years of designing the very architecture they had tried to steal. I hit the enter key exactly as the clock shifted to 11:59 p.m. For a span of 10 seconds, nothing happened. The board members held their collective breath. Then, a notification pinged on the CEO laptop, followed by another, and then a cascade of alerts. echoing from the phones of every executive in the room. The global routing systems were coming back online. The main warehouse automation protocols reconnected. The logistics grid was functioning again. The physical relief in the room was palpable. Men and women slumped back into their expensive ergonomic chairs, wiping sweat from their foreheads. I closed my laptop slowly. I did not smile, but a deep sense of satisfaction settled into my bones. I turned my attention back to Julian. He was staring at his own screen, watching the metrics stabilize, knowing that I had just undone in seconds what his entire team of outsourced replacements could not fix in days. The CEO stood up and pointed a trembling finger at Julian. There was no corporate doublespeak this time. The mandate was clear and immediate. Julian was told to clear his desk by morning. His grand vision of replacing senior engineering talent with cheap, automated code generation had cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars in stalled shipments and broken contracts. He had tried to push out a 55-year-old architect to make a name for himself, and instead, he had engineered his own professional execution. Julian stood up, his face flushed red, and walked out of the room without looking at any of us. He resigned in disgrace before sunrise. By the end of the week, Aeroflux Logistics had to face the music. The outage had been too widespread to sweep under the rug. On Friday morning, a public apology was posted on the main company website and pushed to all their enterprise clients. The statement blamed an unforeseen critical fault in a legacy system migration, wrapping the disaster in layers of public relations jargon. They promised sweeping organizational changes and a renewed commitment to infrastructure stability. They did not mention my name, nor did they explicitly detail how Julian had nearly destroyed their operational capacity. But the tech industry is a small world. Word travels fast across private messaging channels and exclusive networking groups. Everyone who mattered knew exactly what had transpired. They knew the CTO had tried to replace his most critical human infrastructure and failed spectacularly. The resignation of Julian Thorne made headlines in several major trade publications, cited as a mutual departure due to shifting strategic visions. We all knew it was a firing disguised as a polite exit. He was toxic now, radioactive to any serious tech firm looking for stable leadership. I watched the news roll in from the comfort of my home office, sipping coffee and reading the frantic damage control articles. My bank account reflected my victory perfectly. The first installment of my consulting fee had cleared, an amount so large it rendered my previous salary irrelevant. I had financial security that most people only dream of, all secured by a single stroke of a pen and a 16-character command line entry. But the money was only part of the reward. My inbox was suddenly flooded with new job offers. Competitors of Aeroflux Logistics, massive supply chain conglomerates, and boutique tech firms were reaching out daily. They were offering principal architect positions, advisory board seats, and naming their own prices. They recognized the value of the man who held the keys to the kingdom. I took my time reviewing the offers, feeling absolutely no pressure to accept any of them immediately. I spent my days refining my own personal projects and enjoying the quiet peace of my home. I had proven a fundamental truth that arrogant executives like Julian often forget. You can buy software and you can rent hardware, but real leverage is knowledge. It is the deep, fundamental understanding of how the pieces fit together, how the architecture breathes, and where the critical stress points lie. They thought they could discard me because of my age and their misplaced faith in an automated future. Instead, they handed me the power to dictate my own terms. I was Gideon Vance, and I had never been more valuable.